It was a quiet night in the city, the kind where the shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer, and the streets carried an eerie silence. On a dimly lit corner, a homeless man sat alone, bundled up against the cold, with nothing but a small cardboard sign and a tattered blanket to shield him from the harsh world. He seemed vulnerable, forgotten, just another soul lost in the cracks of society, or so it appeared. From down the street, a group of men approached, their laughter cutting through the night. These weren't the kind of men you'd want to cross paths with after dark. They carried an air of arrogance, their voices mocking and their eyes scanning for trouble. And when they spotted the homeless man, hunched over and minding his own business, they saw an easy target. To them, he was just another nobody, someone they could intimidate and push around without consequence. They didn't know who they were dealing with. As they closed in, their voices grew louder, their tone more threatening. The man didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his eyes calm but piercing. What the thugs didn't realize was that this seemingly defenseless man wasn't as helpless as he looked. Before life had brought him to the streets, he had lived a very different one, a life of strength, discipline, and precision. He was a former boxer, a fighter who had once commanded the respect of roaring crowds. His fists were a force to be reckoned with, and his instincts, though buried under years of hardship, were still razor-sharp. The air grew tense as the thugs began to close in, unaware that their plan was about to backfire spectacularly. What happened next would leave them and anyone who witnessed it completely stunned. The tension in the air was palpable as the group of thugs surrounded the homeless man. They laughed and jeered, their voices dripping with mockery. One of them, a wiry guy with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward and kicked the man's sign over. The cardboard fluttered to the ground, revealing shaky handwriting that read, "Just trying to survive." Survive? The thug scoffed, kicking at the man's blanket. You should have picked a better place to beg, old man. The homeless man didn't react immediately. He simply straightened up, his withered face catching the dim glow of the streetlight. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto the thugs, and for a brief moment, the younger man faltered. There was something unsettling in the way the man stared, calm, unyielding, like he'd seen worse than any of them could imagine. But the moment passed, and the thug shook it off, laughing nervously as he motioned for the others to step closer. Hey, don't waste time, another thug said, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his arms. Let's just teach him a lesson and move on. As they closed in, the homeless man slowly rose to his feet. He wasn't a tall man, but there was a quiet strength in the way he moved, deliberate and controlled. The kind of movement that comes from years of training, of understanding how to control your body in the heat of a fight. He dusted off his worn coat and cracked his neck, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness of the night. You boys really want to do this? He asked, his voice low and gravelly. The group hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his tone. It wasn't pleading or afraid, it was confident. Almost amused. Scarcheek sneered and took a step closer. What are you gonna do, old man? Throw your blanket at us? The homeless man tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. No, he said simply. But I'll give you one chance to walk away. The challenge hung in the air, and for a split second, the group seemed unsure. But Scarcheek wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. He lunged forward, his fist swinging wide and wild. It was the kind of punch you'd expect from someone who thought size and anger were enough to win a fight. The homeless man sidestepped effortlessly, his movements fluid and precise. In the same motion, his hand shot out, catching Scarcheek's wrist and twisting it just enough to make the younger man yelp in pain. With a controlled shove, he sent Scarcheek stumbling backward, clutching his arm. The others froze, staring in disbelief. What the? The tattooed thug muttered, his voice tinged with a mixture of anger and unease. You're out of your league, the homeless man said, his voice steady. But if you want to keep going, I won't hold back. The burly thug growled and charged, fists swinging. This time, the homeless man didn't wait. He stepped into the attack, his body a blur of motion. His fist connected with the thug's ribs, a sharp, devastating strike that sent the man crumpling to the ground, gasping for air. Before the others could react, the homeless man turned and delivered a swift kick to the knees of another thug, sending him toppling over with a cry of pain. The remaining two hesitated, their confidence shaken. They hadn't signed up for this. What was supposed to be an easy target had turned into a nightmare, and now they were questioning whether it was worth the trouble. But Scarcheek wasn't ready to admit defeat. "He's just one guy," he barked, trying to rally the group. "We can take him." The homeless man's eyes narrowed. "That's the thing," he said quietly. "I'm not just one guy." For a brief moment, the thugs caught a glimpse of something deeper in the man, an intensity, a fire that hinted at a life they couldn't begin to understand. This wasn't just some down-on-his-luck vagrant. This was someone who had faced challenges far greater than a group of petty street bullies. The homeless man stepped forward, his stance solid and unyielding. His fists were clenched, but his movements were measured. He wasn't fighting out of rage or desperation, he was in control, every step and strike calculated. And as the thugs scrambled to regroup, they realized they weren't just up against a man, they were up against a fighter. A boxer who had once stood toe-to-toe with opponents in arenas, under bright lights, with crowds roaring his name. The sounds of the scuffle drew the attention of a passerby, a young woman walking her dog. She stopped a few yards away, watching in shock as the homeless man disarmed and disarmed each thug with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. Her dog barked nervously, tugging at the leash, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. "Should we call the police?" another passerby whispered, joining her. The young woman hesitated, watching as the homeless man expertly dodged another attack and countered with a swift punch that left the thug sprawled on the ground. "I don't think he needs help," she murmured. By now, the thugs were outmatched and out of breath. Scarcheek staggered backward, his bravado all but gone. "This isn't over," he spat, trying to save face. "You'll regret this." The homeless man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his breathing steady, his expression calm. The thugs retreated, dragging their injured comrades with them, their threats ringing hollow as they disappeared into the night. For a long moment, the street was silent again. The homeless man picked up his blanket and cardboard sign, brushing off the dirt. The young woman approached cautiously, her dog still barking softly. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. The man nodded, his expression softening. "I'm fine," he said. "They won't bother anyone else tonight." She studied him, her curiosity piqued. "That was incredible. You're not just some random guy, are you?" He smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I used to be somebody," he said, his voice trailing off. "A long time ago." As he turned to leave, the young woman called after him. "Wait. What's your name?" The man paused, glancing back over his shoulder. For a moment, it seemed like he might answer, but then he shook his head. "Names don't matter out here," he said quietly. "Stay safe." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a story that would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. But this wasn't the end. For the thugs, for the curious bystanders, and for the man himself, this night was just the beginning of something much bigger. The night deepened, and the city lights flickered in the distance as the homeless man disappeared into the maze of alleys and side streets. He moved with purpose, his steps silent, blending into the shadows as if he were a part of them. Despite the calm exterior he had shown, his mind raced. The encounter with the thugs wasn't something he could brush off, not because he feared them coming back, but because it stirred something he had tried to bury, a part of himself he had hoped was long gone. As he walked, he replayed the fight in his head, every movement, every strike. His body had responded on instinct, muscle memory taking over like it always had in the ring. But it wasn't just the physical toll that lingered, it was the emotional weight. He had spent years avoiding violence, trying to atone for the damage he'd caused in his past. And yet, tonight, it had all come rushing back, unbidden and unstoppable. He turned a corner and arrived at a small makeshift shelter tucked beneath a crumbling overpass. A few others were there, huddled around a weak fire, their faces lined with weariness. One of them, an older woman with a kind face, looked up as he approached. "Back already?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. "Thought you'd be out all night." He shrugged, lowering himself onto a piece of cardboard near the fire. "Ran into some trouble," he said simply. The woman frowned, concern flashing in her eyes. "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." She didn't press further, but the way she looked at him suggested she knew there was more to the story. The others didn't ask questions either, though one or two of them exchanged uneasy glances. Trouble wasn't unusual for people like them, but there was something different about him, and everyone seemed to sense it. As the fire crackled, the man's mind wandered back to the young woman he had seen earlier. Her curiosity, her persistence, they reminded him of someone from his past. Someone he hadn't thought about in years. A memory surfaced, unbidden, the roar of a crowd, the sting of sweat in his eyes, and a voice cheering him on from the sidelines. It was a memory of hope, of purpose. And yet, it felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the thugs who had attacked him weren't taking their defeat lightly. Scarcheek paced back and forth in a dimly lit room, his jaw clenched in frustration. The others sat slumped on a battered couch, nursing bruises and licking their wounds. "I can't believe we got shown up by some old bum," one of them muttered, his voice filled with shame. Scarcheek shot him a glare. "He's not just some bum," he snapped. "You saw how he moved. That guy's trained military, maybe. Or a fighter." The tattooed thug, still wincing from the blow to his ribs, spoke up. "Does it matter? We're not letting this slide, right?" "Of course not," Scarcheek growled. "Nobody embarrasses me like that and gets away with it." The room fell silent as the group considered their next move. They didn't know who the man was or where he had come from, but they were determined to find out. Scarcheek's pride wouldn't allow him to let it go, and his anger was infectious. They started brainstorming, their voices low and conspiratorial, as they planned their revenge. At the same time, the young woman who had witnessed the fight couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. She sat in her small apartment, scrolling through her phone, searching for anything that might explain who the homeless man was. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Finally, she decided to take action. The next day, she returned to the area where she had seen him, hoping to catch a glimpse of him again. She walked the streets, her eyes scanning every corner, but there was no sign of him. She asked a few people if they had seen a man fitting his description, but most shrugged her off, unwilling or unable to help. Just as she was about to give up, an older man sitting outside a corner store spoke up. "You looking for the guy who took out those punks last night?" She turned to him, surprised. "You know him?" The man chuckled. "Not really. He keeps to himself. But I've seen him around. Tough guy, doesn't say much. Why do you want to find him?" I want to understand," she said, unsure of how to explain her curiosity. "There's something about him. He's not what he seems." The old man nodded knowingly. "Yeah, he's got that look, doesn't he? Like he's seen things most of us can't imagine. If you really want to find him, try the overpass on 9th. That's where he's been staying lately." She thanked him and hurried off, her heart racing. She didn't know what she would say when she found him, but she knew she had to try. That night, as the man sat by fire under the overpass, he heard footsteps approaching. He tensed instinctively, his body ready for a fight, but when he looked up, he saw the young woman standing a few feet away. "You again," he said, his voice calm but wary. "What do you want?" "I just want to talk," she said, holding up her hands to show she meant no harm. "Please." She stepped closer, sitting down on cold ground across from him. "I saw what you did last night," she began. "You were incredible. But who are you? Why are you out here?" He sighed, his gaze dropping to the fire. "I'm nobody," he said after a long pause. "Just a man trying to survive." "I don't believe that," she said firmly. You're more than that. You've been through something that brought you here. And I think it's worth knowing. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and reluctance. For a moment, he considered opening up, sharing his story. But then he shook his head. You wouldn't understand, he said quietly. And it wouldn't change anything. She didn't press him further, sensing that he wasn't ready to share. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich, placing it on the ground in front of him. For what it's worth, she said, I think you're wrong. I think your story matters. And I hope someday you'll share it. As she got up and walked away, the man watched her go, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was: gratitude, regret, or something else entirely. All he knew was that his carefully constructed walls were starting to crack, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep them from crumbling.